I call your name. Days get long, I call your name. Chains get broken, set my spirit free. Oh, Lord, remember me.
Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions. We're looking in this series at the book of Judges. If you missed out last week when we did an introductory session, it may well be worth reviewing that, as I think it provides the building blocks on which we're going to move on into the story in more detail. This evening we're going to look at the opening section of the book of Judges. It's a long section. It runs basically from Judges chapter 1 through to Judges chapter 3 and verse 6. And it's a transitional passage. It's a transitional story. What it does, it takes us from the death of Joshua. It reconnects with the story of Joshua. And of course, it begins to tell us a little bit about the occupation of the promised lands. It also leads us forward into some of the great issues that will emerge in the following chapters. In one sense, it provides some of the initial reasons why failure becomes such a big thing in the life of the people of Israel as they seek to settle and establish themselves in the promised land. It shows us the roots of where things begin to go wrong, and then of course the inevitable consequences that we will come across as we move into the next section in the book of Judges. The initial failing of Israel to be obedient to the desires of God for them to completely occupy the land and to get rid of their enemies, the failure to do that will haunt them for the period of the Judges. But as we know, as we move later on into other books of Scripture, we find that this is something that will probably haunt them for the rest of the whole of the scriptural stories. It's the initial failing of the conquest of the promised land that will really haunt the nation of Israel for the next 200 years as we see the stories emerging in the book of Judges. But beyond that, it will also haunt the nation of Israel for the rest of the biblical period. And possibly it could be argued way beyond that, even through to today. Thorns and gods will prove to be their undoing, as we will discover in this passage. And of course, all of that progresses through the rest of the Old Testament and leads us to that point, the second exile, when the nation of Israel is carried off into Babylon, although it didn't exist, of course, as a complete nation at that time, but a northern kingdom of Israel and, of course, the southern kingdom of Judah. So we're going to read a long passage, and I'm not going to read that for you. I've asked my good friend David Suchet to do that for us. His voice is much more suitable to be listened to over a long period. So sit back and relax, and if you have your Bibles with you, you may want to find and follow through on this as David reads it for us.
The Book of Judges. Judges chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands. The men of Judah then said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, Come up with us into the territory allotted to us, to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours. So the Simeonites went with them. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they found Adoni-Bezek, and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him, and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Then Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also, and took it. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. After that, Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev and the western foothills. They advanced against the Canaanites living in Hebron, formerly called Kiriath-Arba, and defeated Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. From there they advanced against the people living in Debir, formerly called Kiriath-Sepher. And Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath-Sepher. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage. One day, when she came to Othniel, she urged him to ask her father for a field. When she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, What can I do for you? She replied, Do me a special favor. Since you have given me the land in the Negev, give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. The descendants of Moses' father-in-law, the Kenite, went up from the city of palms with the people of Judah to live among the inhabitants of the desert of Judah in the Negev near Arad. Then the men of Judah went with the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, and attacked the Canaanites living in Zephath, and they totally destroyed the city. Therefore it was called Hormah. Judah also took Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, each city with its territory. The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains, because they had chariots fitted with iron. As Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove from it the 3 sons of Anak. The Benjaminites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites, who were living in Jerusalem. To this day the Jebusites live there with the Benjaminites. Now the tribes of Joseph attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. When they sent men to spy out Bethel, formerly called Luz, the spies saw a man come out of the city, and they said to him, Show us how to get into the city, and we will see that you are treated well. So he showed them, and they put the city to the sword, but spared the man and his whole family. He then went to the land of the Hittites, where he built a city, and called it Luz, which is its name to this day. But Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan, or Taanach, or Dor, or Iblam, or Megiddo, and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron, or Nahalol. So these Canaanites lived among them, but Zebulun did subject them to forced labor. Nor did Asher drive out those living in Akko, or Sidon, or Alab, or Aksib, or Helba, or Aphek, or Rehob. The Asherites lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, because they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth-Shemesh or Beth-Anath. But the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land, and those living in Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anath became forced laborers for them. The Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down into the plain. And the Amorites were determined also to hold out in Mount Heres, Ajalon, and Shaalbim. But when the power of the tribes of Joseph increased, they too were pressed into forced labor. The boundary of the Amorites was from Scorpion Pass to Selah and beyond. Judges chapter 2. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt, and led you into the land that I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall not make a covenant with these people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them up out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger, because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and said, Because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel, and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. Judges chapter 3. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites living in the Lebanon mountains from Mount Baal-Hermon to Lebo-Hamath. They were left to test the Israelites, to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands which he had given their ancestors through Moses. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons, and served their gods.
As we enter this opening section of the book of Judges, we find that it makes a surprisingly good start. If we know where we're going and all that we're going to face in the succeeding chapters, well, it does seem surprising that things at first, initially, seem to be going quite well. Joshua, of course, is dead, and the people initially, we're told, call upon the Lord for guidance on how the conquest is going to proceed. Although there's some initial suggestion here that things right from the very beginning are not quite going to plan, nonetheless, it does seem to make quite a bright start. Judah is to lead the initial phase of occupation that we find in the book of Judges. The direction is from the south to the north, which will become a significant direction through the whole of the book of Judges. In turn, it's Judah that looked to the Simeonites to help, and together they collaborate and bring about the defeat of sections of the Canaanite and the Perizzite population. Straight away, we get some startling figures in terms of the number of people being killed. 10,000, we're told, right at the very beginning of the book, which initially, I guess, strikes us as being unthinkable. Although, of course, in the light of some of the wars of the 20th century and even into some of the wars that we're seeing today, that number is not startling, even in the modern context. But to find it in Scripture, of course, causes us to ask certain questions, and those questions, hopefully, we're going to address as we go along. What we initially can say is that this was an age of brutality. And of course, we recognize that to be true also not only of this particular age, but also, of course, of our present age. The action then moves in a new direction. Initially, it's on the large scale. We're talking about tribal groups. Then it becomes very personalized. You get the first of these little cameo stories that we're going to see throughout the book of Judges. We are told that Adoni-Bezek is captured and mutilated, which of course was a sign of his humiliation and of course his own loss of power. Then we move back into the larger story. Again, the city of Jerusalem is attacked, but later we find it's only truly brought under control during the reign of David. It's at that point it becomes the capital of the nation, which again is beginning to suggest something to us. The task that God has set for his people is not being carried out on God's terms. We then meet another little cameo story, and this story is centered on one of the earlier figures that we've met in the book of Judges, the latter part of the Pentateuch, and that, of course, is the person of Caleb. It was Caleb, together with Joshua, who were sent as spies into the land to spy on the land to see if it was possible for the people of Israel to occupy it. Well, alongside Joshua, therefore, he would have been seen as a very significant leader, somebody of a previous generation who had been part of this whole story of entry into Canaan, into the promised land. And here we see Caleb negotiating, making an offer. And of course, that offer resonates with much of what we will see later on in the book as a whole, he offers the hand of his daughter. And the one who ends up taking the hand of his daughter appears, as far as I can see, to be the cousin of his daughter. So straight away you can see that things are becoming a little bit grey. Things are becoming a little bit unclear as we're moving into the story of how the occupation is taking place. And then we get a little insight into not only family life, but also some of the needs of the people at the time in this little cameo story. The land, of course, is a reflection of the fact that the people have moved from being a nomadic people into what we might describe at this point initially as a semi-nomadic existence. Later on, of course, very much more a settled existence. And we see two fundamental needs that people have reflected in the request of Caleb's daughter. And that is, of course, one, for land to grow crops on, and number two is access to water. Both of those things are fundamental to life. So whilst we're seeing the big picture of the occupation, and initially we see some success, but we're also seeing some suggestion that things aren't going according to plan, we're also at this point seeing the needs of individual families for land and, of course, access to water, the very basis of settlement in the land. And then we come into this passage that we could describe as thorns and gods. The tribes, each of them, of course, have been allocated lands. That's how the occupation is meant to go. And each tribe is keen to actually achieve that, to secure the land that has been allocated to them. But as the occupation continues, it becomes clear that this isn't going to be straightforward. We're not told why it's not straightforward at this particular junction. It seems to be that there's a lot more military opposition than first expected. Judah fails in its task because of the military strength of the enemies on the plain. They have these iron chariots, which of course in modern terms you might think of as very sophisticated tanks. This was a sign of the strength of these dwellers on the plains, and clearly Judah cannot overcome their enemies in that sense. And then, of course, we're told that the Benjamites, in turn, well, they failed to dislodge the Jebusites in Jerusalem. And then we have this compromise, some kind of city share that's going to take place and wouldn't be sorted out, of course, until the time of King David. Bethel initially is taken by the house of Joseph, but Manasseh fails to drive out the Canaanites' settlements. And even though at times they forced the Canaanites into forced labor, we get that sense that this isn't a cause part of God's justice and his righteousness. This is how the occupation is meant to be. There's too much compromise. There's too much of what God desires not being carried out to the letter as God would have wanted it. And that's the point. They're entering into compromise. They're adopting the methods of other nations to achieve their purposes, or they're just simply not, there's not that willingness, that drive, that determination, maybe the belief to overcome their enemies and to rid the land of them. This is moral and spiritual decline. And where's its roots? Well, it's rooted in their desire to assert themselves, but also it's rooted in idolatry. This compromise, this settling alongside other tribal groups from other parts of the world, well, that's going to lead to idolatry, the adoption of other gods. Here we see God's people thwarting God's purposes. And of course, inevitably, there will be consequences to that happening. And so what we have here then is a picture of incompleteness. We have a picture of partial control. The land is not brought under the control of God's people. It's a give and take situation. And clearly that needs to be challenged. And we're told it's an angel of the Lord who challenges. Now, however we understand the angel of the Lord figure that we find very much at the beginning of chapter 2, however we see that in terms of a supernatural being, or is it a human with great spiritual insight and discernment, however we understand it, the message is clear that at the heart of all of this failure is disobedience. And the outcome of that will prove to be a thorn in their side. And the gods of their neighbors, those that they have settled alongside, will prove to be irresistible for them. The seeds of failure have been sown, and those seeds will grow and root themselves and create the setting for the book of Judges. In fact, they will create the setting for the whole of the Old Testament story. Moving on, we come to the point then in chapter 2 and verse 6, where we reconnect with the story of Joshua. The account that we find in the book of Joshua, the way that the land is occupied, seems to be very different to what we're seeing in the book of Judges. And we have to understand that the occupation is going in different phases at different times, and different outcomes, of course, are resulting. This is a theological view. We're not meant at this point to take any of the details too literally. What we're seeing here is a theological warning emerging. If you don't deal with the problem, if you don't do things God's way, then these are the consequences that are going to result. If you don't maintain God's justice and righteousness, then of course you're on this downward spiral that we will see throughout the whole book. It's not the details that count. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's the theological picture that is beginning to emerge out of this book that is really important, and we're being shown that very clearly. It's not just military failure. It's a failure of a people to maintain covenant loyalty and commitment. And in contrast to that, well, God remains faithful and true to his covenant promises. He constantly feels pity for the plight of his people. He continues to hear their cry. They seem to remain very half-hearted at best and very fickle. Suddenly, again, we're in flashback modes. We're told again of the death of Joshua and the sadness of the loss of this battle-hardened generation that had initiated the occupation of the land. It would be easy then to see that what we have here is a different section, perhaps a distinctive section, perhaps written by a different author or edited by a different editor or a school of editors. I think actually the two come very much together. They're complementary. The first, what we've read up to the beginning of the recap, that we find in verse 6 of chapter 2, is all about the military conquest. It's from the viewpoint of the armies of these tribes, the tribes of Israel. What we have in verse 6, chapter 2, is much more a view of religious significance. This is how God is seeing what's going on. This is how Yahweh is responding to what is taking place. And what we see here is that as we've moved from this battle-hardened generation who had experienced much of the initial conquest and challenges of entering into the promised land, is that a new generation has emerged, and they seem much more compromised on their commitment to their covenant promises. They're going for an easy life. They're making those compromises that will settle them alongside those that God very clearly had told them they were to rid the land of. The inevitable outcome of that is that God is no longer with them in the way that he's been with their forefathers. And now they're entering into a very long period when they would face consistent defeat when they came up against their enemies. When we enter into chapter 2 and verse 15 onwards, we see the first obvious example of this cycle, which we talked about in the introductory session. It was reviewed then, and of course we will see it continuously worked out in the succeeding chapters of the book of Judges. Defeat leads to distress. God responds to their distress, and he raises up judges, or tribal leaders, as I would prefer to call them, to save them. But when things get better, they go back to where they've been. They begin to worship the gods of their neighbors again, and so the cycle continues. It's a spiral. It's a spiraling down that's happening and taking place. Things are spiraling out of control. And God now, instead of driving out their enemies, as he said he would, if they remain true to their covenant promises and commitment, he's now going to use the presence of their enemies to judge their response to him, to see if God's people, Israel, will remain faithful in a compromised situation. So instead of driving out the enemies of God, as he had intended to do through his people, now the land is this mishmash of different tribal groups, some, of course, of the 12 tribes of Israel, but others, tribal groups from the Canaanites, we're told, from the Hittites, from the Amorites, from the Perizzites, from the Hivites, from the Jebusites. And suddenly this syncretism and compromise is becoming all too obvious. And it's reflected in intermarriage, which is now taking place between the chosen people of God and the surrounding nations, their neighbors, who they have settled alongside. The seeds of future disaster have been sown, and the rest of the book of Judges will tell us how that will be worked out in the life of the people of God as they occupy the promised land.
Chains get broken, set my body free. Oh, Lord, remember me, remember me. Woo!